Greetings, business aficionados, and welcome back to another enlightening episode with the Business Boys. I'm Kev, one of your guides through the intricacies of the business landscape. So, today we are setting sail on a different kind of journey, one that rides the currents of climate dynamics. Yes, we are delving into the fascinating world of El Nino. Now, don't worry if you're not a meteorologist, because we're definitely going to explain what exactly El Nino is. So, picture the vast Pacific Ocean, a canvas for the phenomenon called El Nino. This natural climate pattern is like nature's symphony, affecting oceans and atmosphere alike. When El Nino takes the stage, sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific Ocean warm up, triggering a cascade of climatic shifts. But it doesn't stop there. El Nino's impact spans continents, from reshaping rainfall patterns to influencing drought conditions. Its effects ripple across the globe, often rewriting the weather history. The fascinating thing is, the intensity of El Nino isn't set in stone. It is measured by the warmth of the sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. But here's a twist. Climate change is making these events more potent. I mean, who would have thought, right? Speaking of origins, let's give a nod to the Peruvian fishermen who were the first ones to spot the curtain rising on El Nino. Their observations of the disrupted fishing seasons unveiled this climatic show, eventually earning its name that we know of it today. So join me, along with the other two business boys, Hamza and William, in today's episode. Let us see how exactly El Nino affects the different industries, starting off with the tourism industry. So, Hamza, what are your thoughts on this?
Back in the beginning of May, the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, released a report titled WMO Update, Prepare for El Nino. Well, we're now looking at this warning and the temperatures that we saw in Europe in the latest weeks, for instance, in July. And my question was that I posed to myself was, did businesses have enough time to prepare themselves? And here we're not only referring to businesses, but also industries, if we're looking at this from a much bigger perspective.
I wanted to ask you, when you said did businesses have enough time to prepare for this, did you mean this year or in total? Because El Nino is an event that has been happening for the past few decades. At least it's been recognized for the past few decades, and so businesses in the sector would be aware of such a situation, and I'm assuming they would have certain measures in place in case it comes about.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, Kath. I mean, I've never heard of it before, an El Nino event. Looking at the data, yeah, we can see it goes back really far. But I mean, maybe unless you're a meteorologist, as Hamza says, you might not know about this. I mean,
but I know for a fact that businesses that are involved in agriculture or fisheries would definitely know about the existence of El Nino, because I even read this article about the Peruvian fishermen who were the ones who found out about the climatic phenomenon called El Nino, because they observed changes in the climatic pattern, and they observed that the catches that they got had drastically changed every 2 to 7 years, and they were the ones who initially observed the phenomenon, and that's how people came to know about this. And it's been happening since, like, at least from my knowledge, it's been happening since before 2000s, and people have been aware. So that when you say that if businesses would know about this, I'm pretty sure they would. Most businesses would be aware about this, at least if they are involved, if it affects their businesses in some way.
Look, I fully agree that, many people think of that as though, businesses are fully aware and they should be prepared by the time it comes. But let's just think about it this way. If we look at the tourism industry and, businesses related to tourism, hotels, for example, or, trip businesses or those kind of things, maybe trip or airline agencies. If we just look at those, then if they did predict that this would happen, so let's just take, for instance, the fires in Greece, right? If they did predict that this would happen, for instance, why would they allow passengers to be going to those places? Or why would those, hotels or, businesses within Greece that are related to tourism not be on high alert at that time of the year? So, for example, July. So it seems that although, it's easy for us to say that, businesses should be prepared and everyone should know what's to come because it happens after so-called many years or whatever. Yet they're still unprepared and it still takes them by surprise because we can see videos of people being quickly evacuated from the hotels in Greece, for instance, and everyone is just panicking and everyone is just basically people getting stuck in the airports. So you can still see that businesses are not really aware and the industries are still in danger.
I feel like this also depends on the location because in Peru, the government does have certain policies and certain precautions in place. In fact, sometimes they do even, as soon as an El Nino is announced, they declare a state of emergency throughout the state because Peru is one of the countries that are very adversely affected by this phenomenon. And since they are aware about its effects, they sort of take like a preemptive action. So before anything can go wrong, they would announce their citizens to be aware, or they would take certain measures to prevent any big disasters. So again, I think it comes down to the stakeholders or what certain people have to lose. So maybe countries like Greece aren't usually majorly affected by El Nino, but when it comes to countries like Peru and Indonesia, they would be aware and they would be taking those precautions.
I imagine for Greece, the tourism is such a large part of their economy. I mean, the minimum wage in Greece is like £3 an hour. They need those tourists to come in. So I don't know if I should say this, I want to say it, but maybe it's a risk that the government are willing to take. There's maybe a percentage risk of a fire, and they have so much resources, and they try and balance that, because to say don't come to Greece this year would just be, they couldn't say that.
I mean, yeah, Greece's economy does heavily depend upon tourism. So I think they would be weighing the benefits to the costs, and you don't really hear a lot. I mean, I haven't personally heard of a lot of wildfires in Greece, but I also know that countries like Australia do have taken precautions, especially when El Nino was announced. Because they do know that the parts of Western Australia, if I'm not wrong, gets drier, and there is an increased possibility of bushfires. So they do take preventive measures to prevent a bushfire.
That's for us, Australia, but
Mm-hmm.
Obviously Europe isn't the same because Australia has been having high record temperatures for a very long time already during the summer. But in Europe, it's quite different. But we've seen lots of fires in Greece, I believe, over the last few years, and I believe in Spain as well. But again, the government are probably aware that this might happen, but it's, again, businesses are taken by surprise always, and they're never actually obviously they're never aware of where this might happen, if it might happen on roads or in other islands of Greece. But again, they're always being taken by surprise. So I guess maybe that is something good to kind of take into consideration, the fact that when they're being announced, it's a quite short period between when it happens and when they're announced. So for example, most articles were published around May or June, and so that wasn't enough time for kind of businesses to plan ahead of what they could do if this did happen.
Well, if we think about the different size of businesses, I mean, it was quite interesting. Hamza, you're maybe on the side of businesses are a little bit, maybe don't know. Kaf was more on the side of you think they do know. Maybe larger businesses that have been around for 10, 20 years, they can plan this into their strategy. But I know maybe not so much affected in the UK, but the UK has a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises. And if you've only been around 5 years, I mean, you might not know about the El Nino. I've lived in this country for 24 years, and I don't remember ever seeing El Nino on the news. This is the first year I've kind of seen that headline put out there. So I'm just trying to play the balanced argument here, but I'm just thinking of a small, medium enterprise with maybe 20 employees. I think the technical definition for that might be 10 employees, but it might be easy for 10 people to completely miss it and go under the radar.
I believe this is my first year as well hearing about El Nino in the news, but I've heard about El Nino when I read geography books when I was in high school, but this is my first time actually hearing it in the news, as you said, Will. But I think the reason that it's becoming very, very prominent and very important is because it's mixed with the idea of global warming and the effects of global warming. So I guess because El Nino happens every, I believe, 2 to 7 years or so, and then El Nino takes, or La Nina, or is it La Nina?
It's El Nino because La Nina is when the opposite happens.
La Nina. Oh yeah. La Nina is basically when you have like those colder temperatures a bit. But yeah, as I said, it's because obviously as the years go by, temperatures are increasing because of greenhouse gases and because of climate change and global warming. And so if we're looking at these two together, that is one of the possible reasons why we're seeing this in the news today. And it's becoming very, very drastic to the economy, and that's why we're seeing these effects, especially on tourism and agriculture, for instance, and energy industries.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it has a few different effects. It can make drier places wetter, it can make wetter places drier, just throwing those turbulent events into the mix. So this year there's wildfires, but I mean, it could very easily create massive downpours. And let's say if we're still talking about Greece again, next year they could be having massive downpours and torrential rain and winds, and that could be throwing tourism off as well. So there's many ways that the El Nino can affect the tourism industry, definitely.
Hamza, has El Nino historically affected tourism? Do you have any data? Have you known about anything where any case studies where El Nino has occurred and it has drastically affected a country's economy because the tourism industry took a hit?
Yes, actually, but it's more specifically referring to the United States. So, I believe, the United States between 1997 and 1998, when the El Nino weather event happened, it generated a loss of $5.7 trillion in global incomes and $4.1 billion between 1982 and 1983. So it did happen. I mean, it did cause a dent in the economy at the time, and it also applies to other countries as well, because El Nino is not only, it's obviously about higher temperatures, but these higher temperatures lead to extreme weather events.
That's interesting because this year's El Nino is predicted to bring in losses to the tune of around $3 trillion US.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question would be, it's also very interesting how these numbers are, they've obviously increased from 1982 to 83 from 4.1, and then from 1997 to 98 it's been increased. But it's interesting how this year we actually see a decrease and a figure less than both of these that we've just seen.
I mean, I think we can attribute that to the increased level of preparedness that the world governments and companies are showing. For example, for this year, Peru and Philippines are setting aside billions of dollars to help deal with the impacts of El Nino.
That's interesting. And as we said, this is the first year that Hamza and I have noticed El Nino in the news. And now maybe there is just a greater understanding of it and awareness of it, and people are starting to adapt to that.
Yeah. So we've spoken about a hot topic, which was Greece. So I would say that as a sector, tourism is highly exposed and very vulnerable to the direct effects of climate change and the El Nino weather event. So it's quite sensitive, and things like sea level rising and rising temperatures all have effects on tourism. There are some positive effects, I would say, and there are some negative effects. So some positive effects or impacts would be that some places might receive a higher level of tourism and more people might get attracted to those places because temperatures have remained relatively stable. But some places might have something called last chance tourism, or we never know what happen. We would never know what might happen in the next few years to those places. For example, Venice, because of the rising sea levels, it's sort of going underwater. So we wouldn't know what to expect in the next few years, and so that's why they're called last chance tourism. And from this, I would finally introduce the fact that coastal tourism is the largest component of the tourism industry. Around 60% of Europeans opt for beach holidays and 80% of US tourism revenues. So looking at how we see the future and the fact that global warming keeps getting worse, and the El Nino event will be continuing with us for the next few years. What will happen to the tourism industry and what will happen to other industries as well? So I guess that would be the next topic.
So I decided to delve into the topic of energy this week and the energy industry in relation to El Nino. When we look at what El Nino is, it's every 2 to 7 years, some changing weather patterns and some changing temperatures, namely warmer temperatures. And I was struggling to find any data around how the El Nino event really affects the energy industry. So I thought we'd kind of tackle the topic of how the energy industry is transitioning with the rising global temperatures and the net zero targets and everything that's going on our planet today. So I thought what we'd do today, boys, is we would try and solve the world's energy crisis with a little bit of a thought experiment. So energy generation creates 28% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. It's a massive carbon emitter that we need to get down. And there was an interesting thought experiment popularized a couple of years ago. There's a TED video on it, where we cover the Sahara desert in solar panels. And Forbes were noted as saying that covering 1.2% of the Sahara in solar panels would produce enough energy to supply the entire world. And solar was actually crowned the cheapest form of sustainable energy in 2021. So my question to you boys is, does anyone think this is a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Can anyone see any problems before I tell you what I think?
I mean, that it's in an ideal world, that's definitely a very good idea to solving a lot of our energy crisis. But then I also know that a lot of countries aren't gonna go for it. Maybe I think it would be because it would affect a lot of other industries, like the oil industry would be the ones. The fossil fuel industry would be the ones that would take the biggest hit, and a lot of people would not be happy with that. So considering taking that into consideration, I do think it's not going to happen in the near future, even though it is the best possible way to go about solving the energy crisis.
It's obviously a very big investment, but for everyone to just come, like all world leaders to come together and actually do this, I don't think it will happen anytime soon, and I don't ever think that it will happen.
Okay, well, those are some interestingly pessimistic thoughts. I'll run you through some negatives, which you boys will enjoy, as to why this maybe couldn't work, and then we'll explore maybe how it would work. But yeah, let's say we did this in the Sahara Desert. It maybe wouldn't need all the world leaders, but they would take a massive amount of maintenance. The Sahara sands actually shift and move almost like waves. I don't know if you guys have seen a video of that, but over time they move. They could damage the solar panels. The solar panels are going to get covered in dust. Solar panels actually lose efficiency every year. And I don't know if you knew this, but photovoltaic solar panels, their optimal temperature is 25 degrees C, and they lose 1% efficiency for every 3 degrees they go above that. So obviously the desert is far hotter. So there's a few problems there, not to mention shifting day and night temperatures and the maintenance. We're going to consume far more power in the future. In the last 40 years, we've increased our energy by 3.5 times as much. So although 1.2% of the Sahara Desert being covered now would cover us, we're going to need far more solar panels than that in the future. And some researchers ran solar panels in the Sahara through their model that they created, but they did it for 20% of the desert. And they found a lot of negatives that come with covering the desert that you maybe wouldn't necessarily think of. So because the solar panels are black, it actually heats up the globe. They reckon it would heat up the globe by 0.2 degrees, raised local temperatures by 2.5 degrees. And I don't know if you guys knew this, but a lot of the Saharan dust is blown on the wind over to the Brazilian rainforest and provides a lot of minerals and nutrients, so it would upset that ecosystem. And much like the El Nino event, it would change weather patterns, increasing the rainfall in the desert and making other areas drier. A lot of negatives, but since we're the business boys, I was thinking, how can we make this a viable business model? And this is on the border of Libya, Egypt, Chad, and Sudan, and would apparently cost in the region of around $1.5 trillion. And just to give us some perspective on how much the energy sector's worth, we spend on energy generation, like as in people in their homes paying for their heat and electric, $13 trillion a year. So for an investment of $1.5 trillion, those countries, Egypt, Chad, Libya and Sudan, they could potentially tap into this $13 trillion market. But boys, there's a problem with all this energy generation. Energy lines need to be put to an extremely high voltage, and the power can only travel 300 miles. So I was thinking, can anyone think of a way we could get this power out of Africa? Because right now it's stuck if they were to do this project.
Yeah, so I read about this article which spoke about a few researchers in Korea who basically invented a superconductor that can exist in room temperature. So previously, superconductors couldn't exist in room temperature.
Okay.
So now that they've invented this opens a multitude of applications, including it could be used for power lines, and that would reduce the energy wastage that would be used up through resistance that would be used while transporting the electricity.
Okay, because as I understand it now, there's a lot of resistance in the wire, which is why they put it to the high voltage. But the superconductor would fully remove the resistance, or
Yeah.
at least a lot of it, and allow the power to travel more than 300 miles. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to add in relation to the solar panels being effective and in relation to changing ecosystems. And so I was thinking that I'm not exactly entirely sure if solar panels are necessarily just, stuck and fit there, or if they're also flexible, because I was just thinking that maybe there could be specific solar panels that are created to allow the sun to shift during during the day, for example, and during the night they would um never mind. I don't know. I was
No,
thinking that they
you're
would
trying
do
to think
something
of a
different.
way to work, and I like it
Yeah.
because if these countries could come together and make this work, like this could be a massive source of new revenue for them. And these are some of the issues that I've got difficult solutions for, but it's interesting to
Yeah.
think about.
I would say that maybe my next question would be, how do you think that solar panels need to be continuously capturing the energy, or do you think that they could have a pause? So do you think a pause would impact or have a negative impact on?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that, you said that for every 3 degree of increase in temperature, it would be 1 degree, 1% less effective. And so I was thinking, um, it would kind of have like a timer where it would detect a certain level of when it would go down in efficiency, and then at that level, it would kind of turn around and shield itself from the sun in order to not kind of be affected. And then once it goes back to a stable temperature, it would just like turn
Yeah.
around and face the sun. That would be a really good idea.
So that raises some interesting questions, yeah, because a lot of these solar panels, they actually do have cooling systems which can keep them efficient in the middle of the sun, but then that uses power as well, so that is in theory going to lower their efficiency. And something that I thought you were maybe touching on there was, when it goes nighttime, is the world just gonna stop having power when the sun goes away? I mean, we almost need one in Australia as well, each powering half of the
I
world.
mean, I would assume that the solar panel would, of course, store the power in a battery or something of the sort. And since you brought this up, I think it was Elon Musk a couple of years back. He said that if the US were to turn around 10,000 square miles of the desert into a solar plant, they could power the entire country.
Yeah, I saw that as well. Yeah.
I would say
So,
that if people were to actually want to do it with the new findings of a superconductor, which could drastically improve the efficiency of a solar plant, I would say that it is possible, but it's still away, still a few years away.
no, I fully agree, but I also wanted to add, as you said, it could also be a good idea that we would have solar panels in different parts of the world so that whenever it gets dark in the Sahara, it would kind of be replaced by other ones that in places that don't get dark. So if we were thinking about that, maybe places like, I think is it Antarctica or the North Pole? It's one of them that doesn't go dark for a year, is it? I'm not really sure, but they're one of the places don't go dark and the sun never sets or doesn't set for
It
a longer period of time. So that would be a really good idea if those solar panels take over, plus the solar panels from the Sahara, but those would obviously not be efficient during the night.
it
I
wasn't
like.
or the northern pole, like it was a country, and this country, I forgot which country it was. No, it's a country in the Europe continent. So it's because of the axis on which Earth rotates on. The sun's light, they get sunlight throughout the year.
I like the
Oh,
way
it's
you're I like the way you're thinking, boys. We're not a science channel, but I'll just quickly go into it a tiny bit. So on the equator, the amount of photons coming from the sun, they get a much more concentrated beam. So you can essentially just create more energy. So on Antarctica, or the poles, it's a much lower amount of photons, so much lower energy. And because it's so cold, I imagine they don't work well. Going back to the 25 degrees being the magic number, they maybe, yeah, don't work so well up there. But I like the idea of where can we put them where it's always light. That's a cool idea. Um, but yeah, I'll
I think
quickly go into my solution. I'll quickly rattle that off for what I was thinking. So I was thinking, right, batteries. Can we can we charge batteries up on like massive boats and transport them around? But I was looking, and apparently batteries for their weight are 1% as efficient as fuel. So 1 kilogram of fossil fuels can store as much energy as 100 kilos of batteries. So I was thinking, right, how fast is the battery efficiency increasing? And apparently, in the past, it's been about 5% a year. So if that was to carry on, in around 2100, we could have batteries which, for the way, are as efficient as fossil fuels. And maybe we have these massive boats with massive batteries that could take this power and transport it around. But that's a big theoretical and it's a long way away. It's not a very short-term solution.
so basically like those miniature batteries would be enlarged into like a whole
Giant, more efficient
huge
batteries,
tank.
yeah.
Yeah.
Could you have all these boats coming in, slurping up the
Yeah.
solar and just taking them away instead of putting oil on the boats, batteries. So that was an interesting little thought experiment into how the business boys could solve the world energy crisis. But now we're going to have a little look at how El Nino is affecting the agriculture industry. So over to Kath.
So let's look into some of the most vulnerable crops in terms of which will be affected by El Nino. So some of the crops that are most vulnerable to El Nino are paddy, groundnuts, pulses, cotton, and sugarcane. And from this, we can tell that a lot of the world is dependent on these crops as their as a main diet, or it is incorporated into that diet into that diet patterns. So when El Nino hits and these crops are affected, that would in turn affect the demand for these food products that come out of these crops, and that could in turn affect the economy. So for example, right now in India there is a tomato crisis where the tomato prices have gone through the roof because the farmers aren't able to produce tomatoes as efficiently due to changes in the climatic conditions. And this sharp rise in tomato prices could have contributed to the massive rise in inflation, and that because there is also a growing shortage of cereals such as rice and wheat. This also poses a threat to the Indian households. So we can also see this crisis affect companies in India, such as McDonald's. So in the northeastern states, McDonald's have stopped serving tomatoes at all in any of their burgers. So that's pretty weird. I don't think I'd want to eat a McDonald's burger without a tomato. Like I know a lot of people who hate tomatoes, but I personally love a tomato on my burger. And you can also see that the ketchup and tomato sales in according to ASOCHAM, a National Trade Association. So the processed tomato and ketchup sales have seen an increase by about 40%.
So I guess you could argue that's as a direct consequence of the El Nino. I mean, it might seem slightly trivial talking about tomatoes and different vegetables, but I mean, this could just be the start of the greater effects of climate change. I mean, Kath likes his tomatoes. I like my tomato. When I go to McDonald's, that's what I expect, and it's so we can already see it's affecting businesses on, in small little ways, and these all start to add up, I guess.
Yeah, they do. As we can see, so I'll tell you a few examples of how it affects the world. So take for example the US. It has seen a decrease in agricultural production, and that in turn could turn up food prices and could increase food insecurity. And India, being the world's largest rice exporter, it it has implemented a ban on exporting rice, and this is likely to affect millions of people. And this is also a direct effect of El Nino. So this could definitely affect the economy of India, and people worldwide could be affected by the shortage in such a food substance such as rice. So when we talk about Australia, which is also the world's largest grain exporter, it they've also predicted that it is supposed to be taking a hit due to the dry climatic conditions that Australia experiences around the time of El Nino. So some of the major countries that could be affected by El Nino is, of course, Peru and Indonesia and Australia. So basically, countries in the Pacific region. So when the El Nino was announced this year, did lead it did lead to a lot of panic, and it stirred a lot of fearful memories for the people of Peru because in the mega Ninos, and that happened from 1982 to 83 and 1997 to 98, around 9,300 people perished. And there was a GDP loss of around 11.6%, and in the next one, 6.2%.
I've not heard of these meganinos, Kath. What are these?
So that is just a term that they used for one of the biggest known El Nino events that happened back in 1982, but we've had bigger ones, and actually this one is supposed to be the biggest one yet. But
Wow.
they just termed the 1982 event as Mega Nino because a lot of lives were lost back then. But since then, the Peru government has actually been responsible for designing and implementing new governance measures and integrate climatic and environmental prevention development policies. So it's basically it's called the Contingency Plan and National Disaster Risk Management Plan. It started in 2014 and ended in 2021. So these establish the lines of action against possible climatic threats and sets general guidelines for disaster risk management. So they've essentially come up with a set of policies and precautions to take in the event of an El Nino or similar climatic changes that could threaten their economy or their people.
So, adding to your point, Kev, on how countries and agriculture is being affected in countries all around the world, really, because of El Nino and global warming, um, we see lots of quite a huge decline in bee population in Europe, especially, and especially in Romania. And I remember myself as a child going to the mountain areas and kind of seeing these small sellers on the side of the road as you approach the mountain, selling honey. And so recently, in just recent years, I haven't seen that anymore. So looking at some statistics, um, climate change and the El Nino event obviously has contributed to declining populations of honeybees and other bee species, and these are very important for pollinating plants. And so they're actually too important for two things: plant pollination and honey sellers and honey businesses that sell honey. And so just looking at this in terms of agriculture and plant biodiversity, we can see that because there's no pollination, then flowers are not being fertilized. And so obviously they will age and they will practically die out. And that's what causes a decrease in plant biodiversity. And we do see that in Europe. And it's actually a cause of concern for the future of the bee population and honey, honey selling and plant biodiversity. So that it's good that you mentioned the fact that countries and agriculture, are being affected. So,
I mean, it's not
poor
just
bees.
yeah. So I'm not sure if you guys knew this, but El Nino is also starting to affect the futures market, that is the futures commodities market. So to explain what futures commodity market is, basically it is a commodity of futures. Commodity futures are basically a financial contract that allows individuals and businesses to buy or sell a specific quantity of a commodity at a predetermined price on a future date. So basically, it's like I'm buying something from Will, and I'm telling him, okay, I'm gonna buy 1 kg of rice from you a week from now, but at the price that exists now. So this basically eliminates the risk of the changes in price. That's why the futures exist. So the futures for coffee and sugars rose dramatically upon the NOA advisory of El Nino happening, and experts said that the strong El Nino could massively affect sugar production in India and Thailand, while also potentially affecting Brazil's sugarcane harvest.
So, since El Nino happens every 2 to 7 years, and we're now in this kind of period where we will be experiencing El Nino, um, how do you think that this would affect fisheries and you know sort such that sort of businesses?
That's an interesting point that you bring up, Hamza. So since El Nino is an event that occurs with the sea, it's got a lot to do with climatic changes in around the sea. So basically, it changes the temperature of the changes the temperature of the water, and this in turn affects marine life in a lot of ways because that would mean a change of food pattern, as in they wouldn't the phytoplankton that most of these marine life feed on would would not be as abundant as before, or they would change their location, which would then force these fishes to migrate to different regions in search of better temperatured water. As in, like, some fishes would prefer to be in a colder temperature
Yeah.
for mating purposes, or they would have to shift like to in search of better food. So
Yeah,
to
but
bring up two
is,
examples, yeah, go ahead.
but isn't that like already happening because of global warming? I mean, obviously, El Nino is kind of making things just a bit worse,
Mhm.
and it's adding up to those original figures that we've seen because of global warming. But we do, for example, see abnormalities and migrations by sea animals
Mhm.
from one place to another. So I believe there have been multiple instances where some some sea animal that was supposed to be in one part of the globe reached to another part of the globe, but that was before this El Nino weather event. But as you said, you're talking about like the future of this, right? But
Mhm.
how about maybe in the future these would be more extinct? I mean, they would get extinct and they'll be endangered. And so obviously, like they've been moving from one place to another, but do you think that this might kill them instead?
Okay.
So obviously they yeah.
Yeah, I understand what you're asking me. So you're saying if so one point I wanted to make clarify was that when El Nino occurs, these migratory patterns are sort of temporary, because as soon as El Nino dissipates, they would go back to their previous habitats. So it isn't as long term as you would put it, and but it does have effects on on that environment and on other marine life. But when you talk about how these migration patterns would affect the fishermen, whose livelihoods often depend on getting a good catch. So I'll make two examples out of it. So basically, tuna, which is a fish that is widely consumed around the globe. It's a highly migratory species, and it likes to reside in temperatures of around 24 to 27 degrees. So again, El Nino causes tuna to migrate, and this in turn makes it harder for the fishermen to track down these schools of fish. So that means lesser catches, and the because of these this migration, that would also mean that they don't have the necessary food or the best temperature for them to mate and reproduce. That would mean there is not enough fish that will be produced next year, and that could lead to that could lead to overfishing, which is again another cause for concern, or it could lead to an increased demand in the market for fish, and this could very well affect the economy. So, to bring an example, in Ecuador, the Chamber of Commerce reported around a 9% drop in exports compared to last year, which registered around 2,000 million US dollars. So again, this could be attributed to the decrease of tuna catch this year, which was calculated up to a 30% decrease. And to say another example, Peru. So Peru is very big on anchovies, and they export a lot of their anchovies. And see, they also happen to be a world top producer for an animal feed called fish meal, which is basically made up of ground up anchovies. And back in 2015, they were not able to get a good catch of anchovies, and that led to their economic growth to reach the lowest level compared to the past 5 years. Yeah, there was a again. This was also another thing I read, that 82% of the catch that they had in that year was mainly juvenile fish, as in baby fish. So that means that the reproduction rate has also taken a hit. So that again means less fish in the sea. So this would go on to affect their economies. So I also want to bring this up about this really intriguing and interesting finding that I read in this website called Quiver Quantitative. And they had basically drawn a direct relation between companies' performance. That is a company that operates in the agriculture industry, its performance to El Nino. So they've even given the figures for it. So I'm gonna explain it to you now. So when you look at the company's figures, the net sales in 2014, that is when El Nino first formed, was $32,960 million. And then it declined to 25,775 into 2015, and even lower to around 23,000 in 2016. The same pattern can be observed in the revenues as well, which was 36,000 in 2014 and declined to 28,000 in 15 and 26,000 in 16. So they also said that while this may seem like a coincidence, the 2017 revenues were in fact 29,644 and 28,000, and in 2018 it climbed up to 37,358. So what this shows is that right after the El Nino dissipated in 2016, the revenues have climbed back up. So it kind of coincides with the comings and goings of El Nino. So I think this was a really interesting finding.
Yeah, there does definitely seem to be somewhat of a correlation there. It's hard to say just how strong, but definitely I think we can determine something from that. I don't think listeners should take that as financial advice on how to pick their stocks, but I think it is interesting to observe trends and how the goings on in the world can affect the markets.
Yeah, can we all just agree on the fact that we're living in some weird times? The temperatures are just not temperaturing. We ran into some interesting discussions today on the additional effects of the El Nino weather event over the high temperatures of the global warming phenomenon. So if you want to know more what happens to your honey, ketchup, and trips to Greece, then we're here to debunk those hot topics. So make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell button to never miss an upload from the Business Boys. We have been the Business Boys, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Gav, he didn't do it.
That's fine.